Welcome to the Y-Axis Pod. I'm your host, Tristan Yver, and today I have with me a friend, Arnold. Arnold Lee is the co-founder and CEO of Sphere, and it's really a pleasure to have him here because I think payments and stablecoins and all of these things where the crypto world interacts with the real world are very important for our space, and he's one of the folks that are building at that forefront. So good to have you, Arnold. Thanks for coming on.
Dude, thanks so much for having me. Absolute pleasure.
So initially, maybe let's just tell the audience a little bit about what Sphere is, and then we can kind of dive into you and the team and the things you guys are doing.
Yeah, Sphere is cross-border payments. And so we work on Sphere Pay, which is, if your audience is familiar, it uses a stablecoin sandwich, stablecoins in the middle, fiat currencies on the entrance and the exit. Turns out this is a faster, cheaper, better way to do payments across borders. There's an API, there's a dashboard. We mostly service emerging market fintechs, a lot of B2B. We're simultaneously working on SphereNet, which is a new type of account ledger that uses the Solana virtual machine. The TLDR is that it's a way for fintechs to find each other and to use math and code to verifiably see how good someone else is. If they're trying to go to a new country, want, say, a licensed partner, and basically just streamline the whole process of getting set up somewhere new. We do some stuff on Solana. It's kind of where our cultural roots are. But today we're active on like 11 chains and mostly operate in the Americas, US, LATAM, as well as APAC.
So in the stablecoin world, especially when you start going to some of these emerging markets and you speak with players, how do you talk to them about it? Are they already familiar with it? Do you have to educate them? What do those conversations look like?
Yeah, stablecoins are getting quite hot, and I blame Bridge getting acquired by Stripe for sort of like funneling that at the institutional level. Maybe, the new admin in the States for bringing some, attention and hype back to crypto from a policy regulatory perspective. But at least I'm currently in Argentina. I was just in Brazil the last few months, and I'd say like 99% of the companies here have made probably haven't heard of his stablecoins or like not really considering incorporating it into their core flows. And so there's a huge ocean of opportunity to streamline their internal operations or to make things like, sending payments overseas or plugging into something like DeFi for them. But I'd say at the moment, just as it was maybe 2-ish years ago, when we started like really going down this thread of cross-border payments in emerging markets, it's a ton of education. It's gotten easier. Tether, Circle, these various blockchains, Bitcoin, that's pretty recognizable to people as far as we see. But otherwise, it's a pretty niche group that like really understands the crypto, I'll call it like native side of the industry well. And beyond that, it's a spectrum of people who maybe have heard of it or are curious. I think, it's not really worth investing their time into because of limited resources. And as you start going up the corporate chain, perhaps in size of company, that's when you'll start to see like digital assets divisions. But, in comparison to maybe like the United States, it feels like, maybe like the average person in like Argentina, like knows what Tether is more so than a kid from Jersey. But the average business isn't really thinking about migrating everything over to stablecoins just yet.
And how do you guys approach these conversations? What is essentially the pitch that you give these guys that make you useful to them?
Yeah, the most effective pitch for us has been, listen, it's faster, cheaper, it works better. There's an API just like the way that you're used to. You don't have to learn what a blockchain is. You don't have to understand what a stablecoin is. You don't have to pay like an on-chain compliance vendor, a custodian, change all of your policies, and now kind of like grandfather yourself into becoming a local advocate. You can just treat this technology as just another API, and because it happens to use, a stablecoin and blockchain underneath, it's better. That's usually the best way. Otherwise, like there are a lot of details, and they'll start like Googling like Polygon versus Optimism, like Tether versus Circle, and it's just a lot of extra work that really doesn't matter to their core value prop.
Because the main thing they're trying to do is like pay a supplier in China or something, right? or let's say from Argentina to the United States or something like that.
Yeah, they just want to pay someone exactly like that in Asia, maybe someone in Europe or vice versa. And it's just very convenient for them to have this like proxy dollar account. Oftentimes it's pass through because it might be difficult to get one locally. Your bank might not allow it, or capital controls might prevent it. Maybe there's a lot of paperwork and process. And for a business that's just trying to survive, it's not really relevant. I think stablecoins are just a very straightforward way for people to access something that looks like a dollar account and ultimately to pay, it on the other end. But dollar is involved in like 90% of global FX. So it makes sense why, if you're a successful business locally, you kind of need dollar access somehow to expand.
When I met you a couple years ago and you guys started Sphere or Sphere Pay at the time, it was clear that this was going to be something that the world was going to want, but it wasn't super clear that stablecoins were going to necessarily be the dollar denomination of the world as an easy way to get access to that. How has that evolution been from, I'd love to hear sort of the motivation on why you guys started Sphere Pay the way that you did, and how has that evolved as the market has evolved with you?
Yeah. So for the listeners, we met Tristan like pretty early on in the journey. I still remember being in like the like basement of an architecture building at Columbia, I guess we had the blessing and curse of doing this at the worst possible time. Legally incorporate a week after the FTX blow up, seed funds hit as Circle is depegging, and to your point, at the time, like it's so strange now. Stablecoins just kind of seem obvious as the killer app. But at the time, like the main one in the United States had like just depegged. People were like sussed out by Tether. Like, isn't that the like money laundering one? This is back during like down bad times. I remember a lot of teams like running out of money, or there just being not that many folks left building on chain. And we were kind of forced to look outside the crypto sphere, so to speak, in that no one really wanted to talk to us. No one really wanted to use the original idea that we had, which was this like Stripe for crypto, kind of like a checkout gateway type product. And we had a lot of time. And the only people who were really interested in speaking to us were strangely not on Twitter. It was like a bank in Dominica, like a money remittance provider out of Mexico, money transmitter out of Chile. And that's when we realized that these guys like might not know as much about the blockchain component as CT, but like the desire for using something like this technology to streamline their capital efficiency, use their balances multiple times per day, or send money out to areas where they currently can't do business. From first principles, it just like made sense. And maybe that was the blessing during the curse of that like very deep bear market where people are like, maybe this is it, guys. Like, maybe this is the end of blockchain or crypto. It kind of like taking those early customers and really building around that use case ended up a couple of years later becoming more prominent. And I think part of that is because those types of customers, whether serviced through us or by others, just became a lot more competitive locally. And naturally, price goes up, price goes down. And it's fairly anti-cyclic, this business, regardless of the movement. Volumes, at least on our end, continue to go up, and it's because people need to send money no matter what, bad market, good market. And so I think there's a lot of bouncing around in sort of the idea maze in the early days. But the best thing that happened to us was the fact that like it just seemed very like wasteland. In terms of opportunities. A lot of the things that had PMF before, the capital wasn't there to kind of drive it forward. And so what else is left? And for us, that was the stablecoin use case. Digital dollars, just kind of given our personal history as well, made a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm. For context for the listeners on how bleak it was at the time, Arnold was asking me, man, there's an opportunity for somebody to put money into the company, but I really don't want to sell more of the company. But what if the market never rallies and we need runway to survive and be able to keep building what we want to build? It was like a whole decision matrix at the time. I'm glad, you guys were able to push through that phase and get to where we are today. And I'd be curious, as you said, this is becoming a sort of obvious thing, as people say, in the sense that you now hear, President Trump talking about stablecoins. You hear his cabinet members talking about stablecoins. The SEC is talking about stablecoins. It's at the forefront of everyone's mind, and I think there are a lot of people who have realized that it's a form of primacy for the U.S. dollar, and just instead of like the euro dollar, you have the stablecoin dollar out in the world. What do you think is going to be the evolution of that, or at least how are you guys looking at the world and positioning yourselves for how you think it'll change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And even if you like take out the stablecoin idea, it's worth considering like what else could be a replacement currency. And for us, like economic growth of say like Europe relative to the United States, I think makes that harder as an argument. Like negative interest rates as a recent phenomenon. There's still not a ton of transparency around RMB, CNY, which might also could be considered a challenger. And we're biased because of payments to kind of seeing like what currencies are actually denominated for people like remitting value to each other for various goods and services. And no matter, how many news headlines there are about, I don't know, like BRIC nations challenging like the USD or maybe it's RMB or yen. Truth is, it's like vast majority of payments flows is USD. And it continues to remain USD, even if like the relative percentages might change a little bit here and there. And so probably stablecoins will continue to act as a way for the USD to proliferate even further to those who can't be banked directly. But I think like the devil will be in the details of whether or not like entities, aka chartered banks, which have this unique ability to leverage out their balance sheets, are allowed to be issuers, and to what capacity they're allowed to be issuers. Because as a private company, it's really hard to compete. If a bank is able to do 10-to-1 and you're forced to keep 1-to-1. Probably there's this idea called Gresham's law, where there's good currencies and bad currencies. And the way that you can think about it is bad currencies will always find a way to be relevant because they serve different use cases. An African OTC on a call with like Swift and PayPal and Circle and some others summarized it well when he told me like the streets decide adoption for this nature product, which is for the unbanked. So the unbanked kind of like choose what is common usage. And I think that dynamic will be quite interesting because if say banks are able to freely issue these stables, do it on Ethereum, on Solana, like not have the same level of compliance restrictions that they might with a regular currency, it's very difficult for me to see why they don't eventually just dominate, because they don't even have to generate yield on the first, call it like 100% of underlying dollars that are being tokenized here. But in a world where they have similar restrictions from like BSA on fiat cash, or they're also forced to hold 1-to-1, I think private issuers probably end up doing quite well. I'll call it in like the 3, 10, maybe 15-year time frame. And we see a lot of activity in helping in these types of companies helping bring on corporates. But until there's like a meaningful challenger, maybe like Bitcoin like stabilizes at like 2 million and it just like sits there, and it stabilizes for so long people can kind of treat it as like another stable currency. It's very difficult to see why it's not just USD for the foreseeable future. It's just too good of as a unit of account, and like there's trillions in commodities and like derivatives and like financial instruments that are very difficult to unravel, denominated in dollars. And that kind of Lindy is like pretty insane.
Yeah, and just the global debt is all denominated in dollars. I mean, unless we completely replace the existing global financial system, I think we have a long time until that ever happens. So for you guys, it doesn't really matter though, right? Like if there are several successful stables versus the current paradigm where it's just USDC and USDT, it doesn't matter, right? Because at the end of the day, as long as you can support what your clients need, you give them the services through the API, right?
Yep, doesn't matter to us. Whatever stable they want, as long as there's a mint and redeem function, it serves the same purpose. So at least my view is that this probably ends up becoming like M1, M2, M3 in a couple decades, where like you learn about it in econ class, but like functionally for the end user, like, it might as well just be a dollar cash equivalent.
Yeah, exactly. They don't even really need to see any of the back end. How How do you so obviously, so you're a cross border payments company, API driven. What are the things that you would say set you apart from others that are thinking along similar lines? I mean, I have one thing where today I onboarded to you guys, and I went through the entire flow, and it was incredibly smooth, incredibly good looking of a site, very professional. Felt like I was on a Stripe or something. So those type of things I get, but I'd be curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I think the thing that really sets us apart, and appreciate the comments, by the way. I'll send Jeff this clip, our designer. But the thing for us is B2B latency. We don't do this with every transfer. So for the product that you use, Ramp, it doesn't kick in. But if you're a business and you come to us, a lot of these guys are from, say, South America, Central America, Mexico. Capital efficiency is super important. There is no like Silicon Valley of Costa Rica. And so being able to send payments faster, even if it's like 30 minutes versus 4 hours, could be the difference between using your capital 2 times a day versus 4 times a day. And so I'd say that's the main differentiator for us. We basically optimize the bank messaging in addition to this whole stablecoin transfer and market making between the stable and the fiat version for the money to escalate faster through a wire room. And that's been part of probably the largest impetus of our growth in the last year. For a business that's been set up with us and we've like understood their like sponsor bank, correspondent accounts, the right way to path out the money movement, the median completion time end to end for fiat to fiat with stablecoin in the middle is 15 minutes. And that's usually why they come to us.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense. If they can cycle through their capital multiple times, it's like so much more of an opportunity for them to lean into. So, you've been diving into this world of let's call it money, but really it's payments, it's banks, it's regulators, it's compliance. What are some of the most interesting things or things that have stood out to you or that made you think, what the fuck, why is this way, or this is cool, or this doesn't make sense or makes sense?
Yeah, I'll break it down into maybe something that would be shocking for like a more crypto native, and then something that would be more shocking for a traditional payments person. Because the experience has been kind of like seeing both angles in the last couple of years. Everyone like hates on KYC. Everyone hates on KYB. What's crazy is that that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what goes into compliance. People often argue that this form of identification is very inefficient. And to be fair, compared to like the platonic ideal of like figuring out how to, suss out if someone is real, they're probably right. But the fact that this process can be so annoying is partially why it's effective. That extended back and forth with like a bank or with like an identity vendor, it makes it that much more annoying for a would-be criminal, money launderer, what have you, to be able to put money in and out of the system. So, I feel like there's a trend of like, let's just get rid of KYCB entirely within CT sort of like discourse. We're like, why does this have to exist? I can't count the number of people who have asked me for like a no KYC on-ramp. But the truth is that until there is something equally as annoying or something that is just far more verifiable, maybe it could look like a global DB of like ZK identities. It's very difficult for us to get rid of something like that. So that would be like the hot, like interesting thing we've seen on the crypto side, which is to say like some laws make sense. Not all laws make sense, but we started as fairly Web3 and have like gotten more into these payment, traditional, I suppose, like compliance and risk management weeds. And we found that the most effective way for us to do that dive is to understand where they're coming from and sort of what could go wrong if you don't have certain safeguards in place. I'd say from the traditional payments perspective, a lot is shocking. There's so much juice within Web3, but like you have to be 24/7 on Twitter, doom scrolling through like all sorts of like degenerate activity memes, and kind of just like shit posting to find the gems of the innovations that are happening within like mechanism design or experiments. Things like maybe futarchy or some of the lower level research that's being done on block building. And so I think the high level understanding of what blockchains ought to do, we're starting to see like regulators, banks, even traditional payments companies kind of like get up to speed. But I think there will be a large gap where you really need someone crypto native who like was there. It's so difficult to like go back to a tweet from 2 years ago and see all the other context of what was happening at the time when there could be a gem that allows you to innovate a new type of feature or product or kind of see something play out if you roll it out on chain. But unless you're there, it's very hard to sense where the juice is. And it almost by necessity keeps them at like a higher level understanding, depending on, third party reports or, I suppose like just general summaries of what the tech could do versus some of the experiments that have been carried out. And within DeFi, there's some very useful ones in our opinion that like almost mentally map perfectly to traditional payments. But the blockchain allows for special unlocks that you can verifiably kind of see what human behavior, how it reacts to it. And I'm happy to elaborate because it can sound a little vague, but even just like conditional escrow being triggered on certain payment conditions would be super useful to like pre-funding credit models where, this is the Wise, the Airwallets, the Tunes of the world. But if you're not careful, the history is rife with like people just deploying something on chain and then just like degenerates trying to figure out how to like game it as much as they possibly can. And it's very interesting to see what we call like the net new economic goods be created from this like distributed but like otherwise different data structure that is a blockchain. So yeah.
And when you say goods, you're referring to products, right? Or assets or both, or what do you bundle as goods?
It could be in the form of a product. I would define it as from like an economic definition, which is like a new type of transactional behavior, perhaps that was not previously possible. And us deciding to use this common ledger now makes this new type of behavior possible, or it's likely. Like the common one that everyone points to is the ability to monetize directly off of order flow. But there are several things like that in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you brought up is super pertinent. And it's the reason we've seen so many large companies fail when they try to get into crypto because they choose the wrong partners because they don't have all of that context. And they won't have that context unless they have somebody who has been doom scrolling, as you've been saying, or is deep in the weeds. So that's a really good point. And then you kind of already touched on what my next question was going to be, but it's about risk. So I know in the payments world, fraud is rife and all over the place, and risk management is one of the most important aspects of that. Is that something you guys have to deal with and are thinking about?
Yeah, I describe it as one of the widest decision trees, and like algebraic geometry, like I don't know, astrophysics. Those are probably very deep decision trees. This one isn't like rocket science per se. It's like a lot of inputs going in to compose up a risk profile. It's just very wide. There are a lot of if-thens. And so today it's like fairly manual. And I think one of the exciting things about crypto, about AI are opportunities to automate some of this stuff. But yeah, risk today is kind of like almost like a tragedy where you have to incorporate it early. If you service a specific niche, you can really address that niche well and protect yourself against chargeback risk or like, people trying to launder funds and all that good stuff. But after a certain size, whether you're Stripe, whether you're Coinbase, it's hard to not have false positives. And that, leads to a lot of blowback if, say, you're retail facing. And so I think the key is like, what are the new, signals that we get from on-chain behavior that could go into constructing a risk profile more robustly that would otherwise be hard to obtain if you were just swiping a card on a Stripe checkout.
because a lot of the fees baked into these payment systems are because of the fraud, right? It's like a mitigation for that.
Yeah, it's fraud. It's like kind of pricing in the cost of compliance on top of fixed costs,
Hmm.
roughly fixed. So like interchange, but there's like a pretty large area of a large gray area where different companies will take different positions on how much margin that they should accumulate. Like Adyen, as an example, is like one half or less the card cost of Stripe, and it's
Hmm.
because their customer profile is a lot more, B2B. They can underwrite the risk way better, and so theoretically, it would be possible for Stripe to cut down their margins. It's physically possible for them to do that, but naturally they wouldn't because they want to make $12 billion in revenue a year, and also to their credit, it is something that they have to price in more heavily for, say, a retail transaction. We I think today, because the rules haven't been defined, aren't seeing on-chain transactions being pricing in compliance and risk the same way that traditional payments are. Once those rules are defined, once we have more, I'll call them like edge cases of like that are adversarial, this probably starts to get priced in more.
Hmm.
But at least at the moment, it just seems like it's very close to zero because there's no law that says like I have to do X, Y, and Z to account for the on-chain risk because the regulatory sophistication is not quite there yet.
Right.
But it does explain kind of like the race to zero that I think it's harder for an incumbent within Web2 to understand when they start to deploy like a stablecoin product. Because even if you price compliance and risk in, it's very hard to price discriminate in the same way that you could when like acting as a service provider for composing siloed ledgers, which is what a
Hmm.
normal payments company is.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. And do do you guys work with the card side of things? Do you have to underwrite that type of risk, or it's sort of mitigated because of the way you guys do things using blockchains?
So it's very it's kind of like funny. People say chargeback risk is entirely eliminated because like you can't reverse the transaction.
Hmm.
But if you do card payments, it's not entirely eliminated. Like say card on ramp to crypto, it's not entirely eliminated because the user can actually charge back those transactions, at least on the card side, and double spend. So it's an area that we are in process of exploring. We've hired from like Cash App, from Amex. It's a different type of beast because the fraud vector is so high relative to B2B. But naturally, a lot of areas of the world depend on card payments.
Hmm.
And I think the way that we're trying to do it is to be very thoughtful about the initial rollout because cards are ubiquitous enough where if the thing works overnight, you could go bankrupt if the proper controls aren't in place.
Yeah.
So it's to map out some like what could a traditional say like chargeback protection service provider not know about on chain, because I think that type of alpha can help you better understand a risk profile for like I don't know a CT person. There's some interesting things that you could use to incorporate underwriting them.
And AI is likely going to bring down a lot of the risk in the system, right? If people create sophisticated enough ways to detect sort of like individuals they don't want to interact with or be able to block them more proactively.
Yeah, it'll be very good in the short, perhaps to medium term. And at some level, adversarial AI, like a hacker trying to use this to like basically commit fraud, it'll be
Hmm.
interesting to see how that shapes out. It's like the good AI versus the bad AI. And probably like this is where crypto becomes useful again, or whether you want to call it crypto or just like a blockchain canonical log of events becomes useful
Right.
again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So quite recently, we saw Ramp sell for $1 billion. How, which is great comp for you guys. I'm curious, are you guys a comparable? Is it the same type of business? Where do you differ? What's the same?
Yeah, it's directionally very similar. I think Bridge is very like it almost like agnostic in terms of their go to market, but like globally focused. Hence, because of the domination of U.S. and Euro markets, lean towards there. I'd say that
Mhm.
our focus is much more oriented towards the Americas, U.S., LATAM, and it's partially because our end state is different. The goal for us is to transition more over towards SphereNet over time, as opposed to sell the existing payments company. And that allows us to operate in ways that are a little bit different than a traditional payments company that has to do that like whole 2-2-3-3. I forget the acronym, but like increase revenue twice, like double 2 years in a row, and then 3 by 3 3 years in a row in order to have like a venture
Mhm.
scale outcome.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Got it. And yeah, so this is it's almost a longer term model with perhaps more impactful effects for the world if it works. What you guys are planning.
Yeah, it's our thesis for solving sustainable monetization, and kind of like the almost like tragic cycle of payments companies that we've historically relied on. And so as buyers, we've experienced our current clients experience today on steroids, which is like when a payments company that you rely on gets big enough, they will hire people whose whole job is to like make more money, specifically from you.
Hmm.
And it makes sense. They have to increase revenue by 3x next year. And so the quality of the service can remain roughly the same, but those margins within a business like payments, where like the whole kind of like value prop is latency and rates, are harder to deal with than maybe say an AI that's 10 times better, and therefore I'm like willing to actually pay a lot more money for it because it outstrips my cost. In
Hmm.
payments, it's a little bit more linear. And so our idea is to kind of step back and think about the world in a couple of decades from now, and to imagine like what does the from first principles our payments infrastructure run on private rails by some private company, and observing that like the history of fintech seems to indicate that this thing is becoming more decentralized in its own way, where you like have the PayPal's of the world eventually percolating into regional winners. Now those regions are going kind of through their own startup cycle. Company gets big, incumbent, startup comes in, solves some niche problem better. Maybe they get acquired. Maybe they also grow to be like that incumbent eventually. And then the
Hmm.
cycle repeats. But the people who ultimately lose in this cycle are the end buyers, because now they have to like integrate someone new or replace their old dependency, or get charged more for the same service as last year. And the areas of the world that need this type of payments infrastructure the most, especially that third prong, is untenable. Because if my margins are 5 bips and you take my margin to -5 bips, I can't run a successful business anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is it a hard engineering problem what you guys are working on, or is it more so a sales problem? How would you describe that?
I think it's a type of hard engineering problem, and it's not hard because we're like discovering something. It's not like we're discovering like Groth 25. Like we're not doing like deep like zero knowledge proof research, or discovering a new area of like distributed systems. I think the reason why it's hard is because you take this world of compliance and risk management and of like regulatory standards in 160 countries, and you take engineers who historically don't really like thinking about this stuff, and you have to figure out how to transcribe those rules in a way that is robust technically but flexible, because these laws tend to evolve over time.
Hmm.
Doing that mapping right is, I think, the hard part.
Hmm.
The go to market for SphereNet though is a little bit easier because it kind of sells itself. It's like a vendor that doesn't take margin, and
Hmm.
so from a cost perspective, it's pretty attractive. At least we found so far.
Arnold, I'm curious why payments. Your background is an engineer, right? Computer science, is that right?
So
Um, why payments? How did this journey start? where did you and Luigi meet? Where did this kick off?
Yeah, 10 years ago, me and Luigi were doing our first college sort of like spring break trip to Los Angeles, like today. Um, and yeah, we were just like two guys, mostly grown up on the, or yeah, grew up on the internet, meeting in college in New York City, which is a very big city with a lot of things going on. And we kind of bonded over similar interests. The internet in like the 2000s is not so different, I think, from CT. It's like very, very degenerate.
I agree with that.
Um,
I agree with that.
but I mean, you remember the beginning. Like we were just trying to figure out a way to build something to survive it all. And
Maybe I should rephrase that. Why start a company, right? Why not go get a comfy job at Google or one of the large tech companies? Why take the risk of starting a startup and then, you're dedicating every living moment of your life to it?
um, I think we're a little weird. We can't do the comfy job because we wouldn't know what to do with our time. I think it feels very fulfilling to work on this problem. When I first met you, I didn't realize that payments would be like the thing that we really go deep down the rabbit hole into. But it's easier to like connect the dots looking backwards. And we've really gotten to know like our clients over the last couple of years. Like visit them in person, play Mario Kart with their kids, like go out for beers, and it really reminds us of our own families and sort of like the experience that they had moving from country A to country B. Being able to accelerate that migration process for them is really exciting to us because you can see like the second order consequences if it takes like 50 years to rebuild credit, to bring wealth over, to kind of like start over versus maybe 5 years or 10 years or even 1 year. And so CT is like a place of both euphoria and depression. Like it's a whole roller coaster. But I think kind of like seeing like the end users who benefit from being able to move money faster, being able to grow a local business faster, be able to access more robust current like stores of wealth, be able to sell to markets that they previously couldn't. That's really fulfilling. And even though it's like maybe a bit more painful compared to doing like a 9 to 5 mechanically, spiritually it's a lot less painful because it feels like there's a reason, there's a purpose to what the pain. Whereas we used to be at regular jobs. After work ends, it's like, what do we do?
And now work never ends, right? You're just around the clock, kind of always either on your phone or your computer or on a call or a meeting.
Yeah.
How has that been? How has that shift been? Because, I know how it is to be a founder. You just never stop.
I think it's very fun. The last couple of years have been a lot of growth. It's so much has gone on that I can't even describe it in words. The events just happen faster than I can process them. But it's allowed us to meet such interesting people and see our contributions have material impact on the trajectory of people's lives, and it's really nice, man. Yeah, it's a little tiring. I think you were one of the people who told me this back in the day, but there are only so many, like it kind of is like linearly correlated success with, or odds of success with like how much hours you put in. And the way that I liken it to is like, yeah, when you type out an email or click through Gusto, there are only so many ways to do it. But the milestones, the little wins on the way, I think make it very worth it.
Yeah. No, that is just 100% true in my mind, that the more hours you can put in will put you further ahead of the competition. Like the example I heard that really hammered it in for me is if you have a scientist working on a problem and he's working 40 hours a week, and there's somebody else working on the same problem and he's working 70 hours a week, he's just going to have orders of magnitude more progress over the years than the guy who's doing the 40 hours. And it's the same thing for startups. And you guys aren't trying to find some scientific truth, but you're trying to build something that has impact in the world. So I think it's yeah. Do you have any sort of things that allow you to let off the steam a little bit? Do you have any sort of calming things that you put into the mix, or not really?
Uh, Sometimes I'll play. Recently, I got a Brazilian League of Legends account, uh, which has been fun. Sometimes I'll play music. Been
As in
listening
you
to
like you play instruments or
yeah, like piano, guitar.
nice.
Sorry, that's pretty relaxing. But yeah, for my birthday this last year, the joke was I would like stare at a wall for like a couple of hours and kind of just like do nothing. And I did that. That was like pretty nice.
Oh, you did it? Yeah, they call it a dopamine fast, right? Like you just no book, no phone, no computer, no stimulus. You just have to sit with yourself.
Yeah, I didn't even I've heard of this before. All I knew was that like I'd really like to just like kind of do nothing for a few hours and kind of like let it all
Mhm.
soak in. Uh, yeah, so definitely have some like activities to kind of like calm me down, but I don't know, man. There's no better way to go to sleep than to like read some obscure law about like money transmission in a country that you're thinking about, and so that also tends to help.
How big is the team now?
So I think we just hit 29.
Wow.
Just made our first marketing, finance hires, and a lawyer down here in like the like Brazil, Argentina.
hmm What's the composition look like? Is it a lot of compliance folks? Like, how's this split?
Yeah, I'd say we're roughly 50-50 between like Eng and non-Eng. And within non-Eng, it's like ops, compliance, risk, marketing, finance,
hmm
design. I describe these as like divisions, but they're typically like one person. And so we try to find like, you know, crack people who could kind of do the divisional work.
Well, what were the order of things that you decided to scale out to other people that you realized that you would be better off with somebody else doing that thing than yourself, for example?
Um, that's a great question. And I feel like it's kind of like the hiring algorithm I've done. It's like at
Mm-hmm.
what point do I realize that I'm not qualified to like scale this out and I have to find someone who can replace me? Early on, naturally, we recruited a bunch of engineers. Um, but then I think for a startup at our stage, relatively overinvested in compliance and risk, kind of seeing where the writing on the wall was. Um, Thereafter, compliance related things like compliance ops or payment ops, things that were unobvious to us before we got really into the payment weeds. And now that we're finally doing like cold outbound for sales, we finally have a sales team. And it's getting to a place where we've kind of saturated some of the initial pools we were fishing in to
Mm-hmm.
invest into finance and marketing. Um, but I'd say the main like hot take perhaps that we did was really investing into compliance risk early versus later.
Yeah, well, I think that'll end up being a lot of the edge for your business, especially with how a lot of folks trying to do similar things have approached it. It's just the thing is, I think people don't realize, and this is going back to your comment earlier about how a lot of CT just thinks, hey, why do we have KYC on all of these things? Just screw it, just no KYC, let us trade with our wallets. And if you're a really decentralized product, that's okay. Like if it's actually decentralized, that's okay. But if it's not decentralized, it just now is a perfect attack vector to get that thing shut down. And I think the same thing will happen to other businesses. And as long as you guys don't have those skeletons in your closet, it's a much better approach. And then as you've been saying, also allows you to have the conversations with the banks and all these other players that you need the relationships with. So yeah, I think it's the right move, even though very counterintuitive for like a crypto Twitter mindset.
Yeah, and I think just broadly startup, it's like the function of a compliance risk person is almost to like slow you down on certain threads, and
hmm
that sounds crazy when a startup is trying to move as quickly as possible to not die. I think it's like generally, unless you've seen like kind of experienced the consequences of it, and we did via proxy, kind of just given how we started and sort of like what we saw, it's very difficult to understand like why am I paying this guy basically to like increase the odds that my startup dies because we can't move quickly.
Oh man, yeah, it is a crazy concept to think about. It's very non-intuitive, actually.
Yeah.
Um,
But the gatekeepers of like product unlocks think this way, and as discovered for like some pretty decent reasons. And so we were like, yeah,
well,
this is we
well,
have to
also you
break.
guys have to mesh with a world that operates fully in that plane, and it's not going to work if you guys are coming in at a completely sort of different angle than the one they're operating at. So. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'd be curious to know with the administration change in the United States, does this change your guys' approach to North America? Has it opened new windows or it's still wait and see?
Yeah, we're an American company, American founders. I think relatively, we've invested a lot into the U.S. licensing process to be active in the states, even during a more adversarial admin.
Can you
So I think
describe
this,
that real quick? What are the licenses you require to be able to sort of operate in the States?
yeah. So for us, it's money services business. Excuse me, registration, and then money transmission licenses. And it's so that way we can remit other people's money on their behalf. And there's a whole spectrum of like state law. I'm sure you're familiar with like comfortability or nativeness to digital assets. And we've really narrowed in on stablecoins versus like crypto broadly. But yeah, I
Which
think it
they
just
will be friendlier towards, right? It'll be much easier for them to embrace than like Bitcoin or Solana or whatever.
yeah, I think from a risk POV, like the whole volatility being compressed and being backed through some regulated entity. Um, yeah, we've always had an America focus just because it is so critical to LATAM. And, the whole like same time zone, same area of the world, a lot of natural import export activity. I think this new admin just makes it easier. If they make rules for issuance, frankly, even if the OCC embraces the innovation of this tech, like it would make it a lot easier for banks to participate, for credit unions to participate. Frankly, like 99% of license holders like could theoretically do like stablecoin related like liquidity provision or money transmission. They'd probably have to like ask their regulators do an approval, but it's insane the number of licensed entities out there that could be in the business but aren't today. And so I think it frankly just makes it easier for us to transition.
I mean, for the listeners, when he says they're getting the money transmitter licenses, that is no joke. Every state has their own license. You have to fulfill their demands and requirements and guarantee deposits, and it is an absolute huge mountain of work. So kudos for embarking on that journey. Patience of a saint. I mean, I'm sure you guys have a good compliance team and legal help if you guys are diving into all that.
Sorry.
The thing I'm kind of curious about for you guys now is it all about scaling volume as you build SphereNet in parallel? Where do you see the prioritization of the things ongoing, or is it just like we need to multi-thread, keep every thread running at the same time, or do you prioritize certain threads over others?
Yeah, it's so interesting because SphereNet is kind of like a DB for us, and it's a product driven chain approach, a la Hyperliquid. So we don't have to like divert as much resources towards SphereNet because we're not interested in creating, let's say, like a developer ecosystem around it. We're not interested in attracting startup builders who are building anything from SocialFi to consumer to payments to DeFi. It's a very opinionated and focused approach. And so the goal is to maximize volume distribution because we don't have to make $1 billion of ARR for SphereNet to be successful. Just being default alive and maximizing volume is useful for SphereNet because then you bring in unique, healthy types of order flow that would otherwise not exist on chain. And there's a ton of value from that, whether you're a market maker or whether you're a willing taker, say in a different country that previously didn't know who to use as a licensed counterparty in the United States or in Europe or whatever country you want to send payments to. So yeah, I'd say uniquely focused on volume in a way that if we were trying to just scale up the payments business to maybe IPO on NASDAQ one day, we wouldn't be able to.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And on the remittances front, you mentioned it slightly earlier. It's just such a huge market. It's let these dinosaurs like Western Union continue to be multi-billion-dollar companies. Is that something Sphere can approach? I mean, as a crypto native example, I know that I would say what's the name of the largest Mexican exchange?
Bitso?
Bitso, a ton of Bitso's flow. We're just people using it for remittances, like a ton of it. Is that something you guys are looking at?
Uh, yeah, B2C is an interesting animal. It it's kind of like opening up Pandora's box, but I'd say like in the at the moment, no. But in the end state, like the North Star for us is like from first principles, what sort of shared ledger for payments like makes sense in 2100. Like we should build towards that. And there's no physical law that would prevent individuals from having, say, a limited set of functionality to credit and debit directly against a financial institution. But I think at least at the moment, no, just because there's so much that goes into it and so much that you can't erase thereafter. Pursuant to sort of like our maybe more careful approach as a payment startup is, you know, the collapse of like Wire, of Prime Trust, of Fortress, even some companies, which I probably shouldn't say on a public podcast, who like did unlicensed activity before they got the licenses. Those are stains that you can't get rid of. And that's kind of like the legal equivalent of when you facilitate B2C activity aggressively before you're ready to. And it's something that we just like want to be thoughtful of as a result. It is kind of like the holy grail though, for sure, where, you know, helping a migrant worker maybe in California be able to remit money back to Mexico, or, you know, helping a family, I don't know, pick Indonesia or something, remit money back from Singapore. Like those are some of the most interesting and exciting use cases. But I think keeping it robust, it will be difficult. You know, I once tweeted that like payments becomes a DePIN, and I think the inspiration for that is like it's very difficult to replace, like invest the upfront capital required to set up those like physical agents all Western Union everywhere. But if someone can figure out how to crack that from like a decentralized perspective and use that like a better efficiency in getting, you know, the equivalent of like a Helium node set up, it just happens to have cash. Brandon from Czar Pay is working on something similar for Pakistan. That seems like a physically feasible path towards disrupting like the Western Unions or the MoneyGrams of the world.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Anyone that has a little kiosk just needs to run a machine that lets people come into the payment function. They take some fee for providing the machine.
Yeah, there's no reason why everyone can't be like a market maker in that sense. Like, and people do that in Argentina, which is kind of cool. Like, do it at the grocery store last night. A market made blue dollar against USD. But yeah, that's probably the way to do it. Our sort of like focus at the moment is mostly like a little bit maybe like lower level, which is like the B2B fintech wholesale clearing side of it. It's a little bit easier to control.
For that, there are tons of businesses that can use you. It's more so just explaining the benefits of using you and getting in front of them. Is that sort of the process right now?
Yeah, it's like, how do we alert people to the fact that this thing exists without them having to do a ton of work to understand it? You know, in 2025, everyone's like, oh, iPhones are great. Like, it's obvious what the value prop is. 2007, it's like, it's new, like, it's probably a little buggy, like there's no app store yet. And so the core idea hasn't changed much, but like just kind of bringing people to the table is most of the effort.
And at the very beginning of the podcast, you said that Solana was spiritually your company's home or your home as far as a blockchain goes. Why would you say that is?
Well, Luigi and I were engineers, him from TradFi, me from IoT, starting on chain. We like have known about crypto for a while. In my case, for quite a while, and Luigi since college. The ethos politically and philosophically really speaks to us, but like push comes to shove, in order to make a business around this tech, you need that needs to be physically possible. And for that to be physically possible, it must be very easy to use. So it's got to do the thing and it's got to be fast and cheap. And at the time, we saw Charles Hoskinson on YouTube, but Cardano just didn't work. Smart contracts weren't live. Ethereum, frankly, was like too expensive for us to use. And of the options, Solana was cheap, fast, and it worked. So we ended up just spending a lot of time building out, friendships and sort of relationships there. I think that has resulted in it becoming like our cultural roots. I think like we really agree with sort of the more pragmatic approach of Solana, and like how do you create a company? How do you return value to the world? And that's why I make that comment.
Do you have a view on the state of blockchains right now? Do you think that there will continue to be new chains that are potentially more successful than the existing cohort, that the bases and Solanas of the world will just keep eating market share, that Solana will eat everyone's market share? How do you view, I guess it's a little bit agnostic for you guys because you guys just plug into everything, but personally, how do you view these things?
Yeah. So I don't doubt that until like, it's very difficult for me to see why the next faster chain doesn't continue to get funded for the years to come. But I feel like we're already at a point of like diminishing marginal returns. I think it's very difficult for a general purpose application layer to survive. By design, like you need to make the early people rich for them to stick around, because state is essentially an undifferentiated product. Whether the state lives on one DB versus another. So in order to buy it in the loyalty of like an early community who act as like advocates, evangelists, necessarily it both needs to be way better than what existed before from like a product or tech perspective, but also people need to believe broadly that it'll fail. Otherwise, there is no risk reward upside for that early set of convicted believers. Mm-hmm. And so it's a hard set of circumstances to survive, therefore. Not only does your thing have to be better, but most of the market needs to not know that. And so I think it'll be difficult to supplant the existing general purpose blockchains. I'm sure like it's physically possible. I wouldn't bet against, I don't know, another one kind of coming in and being a contender. But I think, it's interesting, the degree to which state fragmentation of like blockchains is occurring today is probably like way too high. I think people generally underestimate the sort of like two miracles that you need for your general purpose thing to win. I do think that there will be some very focused versions of chains. Naturally, from our perspective, it's like compliance, right? And like maybe it's not open loop. But I think there's some other use cases that like make sense, whether it's like its own dedicated DB or it just posts to an existing one. I'm broadly bearish though on certain like hot narratives within CT, like an infinite rollup future. To me, from first principles, doesn't make sense. Like if it's 10% better, like that's probably not good enough. So whether it's on the vector of like performance or of like expense. And so I think there's a lot of maybe market inefficiency around that, just because of, it's harder to kind of like blow up the bubble in this industry because like the capital is globally accessible and it's not like there's some like authority that regulates it. There are no circuit breakers, etc.
And when you look at crypto from a tech perspective, what are the things you're finding most interesting at the moment?
Well, I think the work being done in applied cryptography for zero knowledge proofs is quite interesting. I think it's like MPC as well. I think these though are like very hard to like generally productize. There needs to be like some opinionated usage of it, but generally it's quite cool because it's like taking math from the 1980s and actually like making it production useful. I think like there are things happening in consensus that are like academically interesting, but I think like Monad BFT, Aptos BFT, Mysticeti, but I don't know if like consensus is really a bottleneck for most chains because you need to hit like past a couple hundred validators, probably for it to realistically matter. So yeah, I guess maybe the breakdown is like there are things that I find like personally curious, interesting, sort of like how I would find maybe a branch of math or like a poem like or a song interesting, and then there are things that are like interesting from like a more practical like business perspective. Futarchy is interesting. I hope it works. But I'm biased towards like the really unsexy stuff because I usually feel like systemically or structurally there's a reason why it's like valuable because like no one wants to spend their time thinking about it.
Yeah. There are so many billion-dollar companies that were built on doing the unsexy stuff or the shit shoveling, as they say. I feel like everyone wants to do the flashy, sexy thing, but if you shovel enough shit in the right place, you'll find the pile of gold for sure.
Yes, sir.
Also,
maybe,
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'll say
sorry.
that.
I was gonna say that maybe like the execution of like Hyperliquid is interesting. Like it's just like wow, it's kind of like seeing a really good dancer or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a better analogy.
I mean, if I had to pinpoint the most brilliant thing that they did, it would be that they were able to very effortlessly have the entire world describe the drifts and the GMXs of the world as their competitor rather than the Bybits and the Binances of the world. And right away there, they did something where they were astronomically better than their competitors, although it's unfair comparison because their competitors are working on these distributed consensus systems while they're in the same, Tokyo AWS server. So really the comparison should have been Bybit or Binance. But the fact that they were to pull that off so masterfully is just kudos to them because I think it had a big part in the success that they saw.
Yeah.
And also they just made a ton of people very, very wealthy with their drop, and they were very, very smart about it, and they didn't try and maximize their own gains by selling tokens all over the place. And there were a lot of things, but I think that comp discussion was very important for them.
Yeah, that's a great point, recomp. I wasn't considering that as much, but it makes a lot of sense.
Because then you're number one, right? It's the number one DEX. It's the number one DEX. It's the best DEX in the world. It's the best DEX in the world. It's the best DEX. Like that just became the narrative. If you're going to trade derivatives on a DEX, you just go to Hyperliquid. Why would you go anywhere else? It's just the best, right?
Yeah. I was thinking of it from like you build this thing and then like the airdrop to like community is so insanely like that must have been a hard call. But from a comp perspective, that makes a lot of sense.
So what is the next 6 months for you, Arnold? What are you when you're hiring, what are you telling people? What are you most excited about right now?
I think there are some secrets we found from like BaaS and from maybe like traditional fintech. And it like makes sense why they're secrets. Certain hires we've made in the last 6 months, there are maybe like 5 to 10 people like them in the world, and most of them are still in BaaS. And so I think being able to take those lessons and apply them within stablecoin land is really exciting from a product perspective. The way to kind of like concretely define it is all payments companies become risk and compliance companies, and then you either drive margin from high risk lending, in effect, or foreign exchange, which and all roads lead back to the same place. And so I think it'll be very cool for a builder to come and build that at Sphere. From the end user's perspective, though, it'll just feel like it's faster and cheaper. So
I mean that's kind of one of the biggest things that must be maybe not for you personally a challenge, but for building companies like the one you're building is that you may do transcendental upgrades that have never been seen before by humankind, and the user will just be like, oh, that was fast and cheap, like nice. They'll have no idea of anything that happened.
It's kind of cool. It's kind of cool because it's the goalpost is very well defined. Maybe like trading, it's like you can be as smart as your test scores say you are, but like what's your P&L? And it's kind of cool. There's almost like an objective metric for the thingies that you make on internally. But yeah, man, for a payments person or even for like a general dev, I think it's like a pretty cool system. We've talked to a lot of our contemporaries in Web2. Think of like the Wises of the world, and they're not even doing it. So it's exciting. Feels like
that's super exciting, and you guys are having a ton of growth, and I imagine just seeing that growth is such a compelling reason to show up every day and keep pushing harder because you just want to see more and more and more growth.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I remember this time last year, I would have killed for like $1 million of volume, like on a day. In a month, I would have killed for like 10 million. And now, we're in billions per year. And that's like pretty crazy to think about. Pretty crazy.
That's great. I mean, it goes to show that you guys are putting the work in and you're doing so in an effective manner rather than just dilly-dallying. And that leads into my next question, which is, you're a founder. You've been a founder for 2 years now. You've raised quite a bit of capital. You have a 30-person team. What are some of the core components that you think have allowed you to be able to do this? If somebody were listening to this and they know they want to start a company, what are things that you think have opened this pathway for you?
So with the disclaimer that I'm still early and who knows if it'll all work out in the end, so grain of salt. But I think one thing that's been quite nice is not really wanting to be a founder historically. It allows me to kind of remove myself from some like ego and status games that I think are otherwise tempting if like your dream since you were a kid was to be a founder, or if like the end state of being a founder for you is directly and indirectly related to ego and status. I want to replace myself. If someone can do my job better than me, like, dude, take it. I've been able to do that for like conference BD, inshallah, for engineering, inshallah. Yeah, I think that's been quite helpful because it really allows you to take 8 players and give them the agency to kind of like run with it, and also to trust you when you pull them back because they know that you're not doing it because you're trying to like boss them around. I'd say that the other thing is. It's going to sound weird, but like video games. I think you have to like be like pretty ADHD as a founder to like be able to kind of survey all the opportunities, all the different threads that are coming in. But I think that games are a really nice way to teach you how to constructively and efficiently evaluate those threads quickly. And up until recently, I always thought that like high level video game, maybe like a League or like a Melee was harder than running a startup. Recently, I think that's changed. But yeah, it feels very similar, which is cool. And so if you've played
one is just bound and one is unbound. One is completely unbounded. So there will just for sure be more variables.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah,
I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 recently. Now that I'm not working, I hopefully it's training me. I'm doing some strategic corporate trading over here.
Yeah, dude. I remember when our seed funding we had closed it the day before the FTX collapse like fell through. People were asking me like, "Dude, are you depressed?" I'm like, "It's still not as bad as certain like video game outcomes I've had."
And I only have a couple more questions for you, Arnold, but one of them is how have you hired? I know you've hired a talent. How have you been able to do that? What have you found that has helped you hire this best talent that there is in the world?
Yeah, I think apart from like a discovery and sourcing question, I think like convincing comes down to the best people are either undervalued by the market and are excited to take an opportunity that the market like doesn't recognize them for. Finding gems in the rough, discovery alone is a unique act. I think for the people who are more pedigreed, have a history of success, they're looking for something, at least from what I've seen, different. If you've already made a lot of money because you're a cracked builder and like you're kind of chilling, usually like what people want is some form of purpose or excitement, meaning to their lives. And I think that the way that I describe the trajectory and sort of like path dependence of Sphere is very nice for that. Because it's a little crazy to get into a first call and be like, by the way, like the goal is not to like IPO as a payments company ever. That's a little bit different.
They're probably like, what?
Yeah, there are a lot of like organizational hot takes within that vein, and I think it might be refreshing for someone who's like more like pedigreed. And I think that's been super helpful for us, convincing them to like hop ship.
That makes a lot of sense. And my final question for you, Arnold, what is a habit or thing that you have taken on since you've been on this journey that you feel has allowed you to either do your job better, be a better person, feel more at peace?
Get good sleep, which is a little ironic because I know I didn't sleep that much today.
This guy slept like 4 hours last night.
But I remember in the early days, I would like be like, dude, I need to grind. I have to put in all this time. Otherwise, I'm not trying as hard as I could. I think these days, if I don't get a solid 8-9 hours of sleep, I'm like just less effective. And so I really try to like treat that time preciously, especially if you're getting older. I'm about to hit my 30s, inshallah.
Me too, baby.
So sleep is, irreplaceable. First principles.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Arnold. Great to have you.
Dude, thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure. For the listeners, it feels awesome because I used to watch Tristan do these back in the day. And so, absolute honor.